ask questions. So please do that, and please enjoy the session. Thank you.
Okay, should we start? 1 minute more?
Yeah, we can start.
Okay. Well, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are at this moment. So it's a pleasure to start the session, Setting Children's Rights in the Internet Governance Agenda, Balancing Risks and Opportunities. I'm Fabio Seni from the Regional Center for Studies on Development of Information Society, the CETIC.br, at the Brazilian Network Information Center, which is a center of studies producing data on ICT, access and use since 2005. So we have 15 years of data production in Brazil. And we are very pleased to moderate these workshops. And I would like to thank this group of very distinguished speakers, renowned for their knowledge and large experience in debating how to design strategies to address children's rights in the digital age, which is the theme, the issue that we are going to cover today. Although 1/3 of all internet users are under 18, according to UNICEF, most regulatory instruments for promoting human rights and data protection may still be vague or do not present a specific recommendation aimed at this group. And besides that, there's no consensus on how to balance protection from online risks without restricting opportunities made available by digital inclusion, such as access to information and freedom of expression. So in this panel, we will mobilize the most updated evidence on how children use the internet and the impacts of those practices on specific rights presented by the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, such as access to information, freedom of expression and other civil rights, and privacy and protection from harm. So before we start our session, I'm very quickly announce the rules for our online intervention. So each speaker will be given up to 10 minutes for initial remarks, and then we will receive your question to the Q&A tool here, but also you can do it in the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the round of interventions. This meeting will be recorded for report writing purposes. And first of all, I would like to start by highlighting the main issues that we'll be discussing during this roundtable. There's a considerable debate about when or how children's rights, as defined by the United Nations Convention, may be realized or infringed or affected using during the digital age. Recent evidence on children engagement with online environment show that the more children use the internet, the more skills they develop and the more activities they can undertake. But simultaneously, the better digital literacy and safety skills children have, the more they engage in riskier online activities. So the balance between opportunities and risks is among the main challenges for policy making and regulation in this field, and especially considering that the scenario is even more nuanced due to the emergence of new technological applications and platforms based on the use of personal data and artificial intelligence algorithms. The COVID-19 outbreak also highlighted the relevance of digital technology in various aspects of life, while exposing barriers to equality of opportunities regarding the internet access and use. So this roundtable is intended to address these issues by framing children's rights as principle for decision-making among stakeholders, including the participation of children as an active voice on this debate. So another relevant opportunity that I hope will be highlighted by this discussion is the inclusion of sound evidence from research and children consultation to support the implementation of those policies and to protect children's rights globally and at the national level. So continued data collection about children online experiences on a wider scale it's imperative to make governments, parents, teachers, and everyone else concerned with children's well-being in a better position to respond to the upcoming challenges. So among the policy questions that we are willing to address in this section, I would highlight three important ones. So how can children's rights to participation, access information, and freedom of speech be preserved and balanced with the right to be protected from violence, from hate speech, from exploitation, sexual abuse in their online environment? So how to balance those rights? How can the evidence available on children's practices online support decision-making, implementing policies that balances risks and opportunities, and also how we can include children's rights in the multi-stakeholder collaboration arrangements that have put in place in the regions represented by this panel. So how we can move to practical actions in this field. So I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. First of all, we have Sonia Livingstone, which is a professional from the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a very important reference for us in this field. We also have Guilherme Canella, which is chief from the section of Freedom of Information and Safety of Journalists as UNESCO headquarters. Thanks, Guilherme, for joining us. We have another international organization participating, represented by Alejandra Trucero, which is the regional specialist for adolescents for the UNICEF in Latin America and Caribbean region. We also have Amanda Third from the Western Sydney University in Australia. Thanks, Amanda, for joining us so late night in our country. And finally, Patricio Cabello from the Universidad de Chile, which is joining us today. So let me invite Sonia Livingstone from LSE to start with your initial remarks. So Sonia, how can we really make progress in considering children's voices at this point of policy making in a digital world where the challenges are amplified? So we are seeing the discussion of privacy, data protection, surveillance, disinformation. So the challenges are huge. How can you move on this new agenda? So Sonia, the floor is yours. We have about 10 minutes for your initial remarks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Fabio. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to be taking part in this discussion. So I'm going to ground my remarks in evidence. I think evidence is the simple answer to your question, Fabio. How can we proceed? And I say that partly because the initial years of any new technology, and the internet especially, are often accompanied by a rise of anxieties and myth-making, in which early policy efforts we often see become very kind of fearful or misguided in terms of where focus should be placed. And so evidence, which is now available, I think is becoming a much better guide for the basis in policy making. So I'm going to share my screen and give you a sense of the project and the evidence that I'm working from, which is the Global Kids Online project. Global Kids Online is a collaboration between me at LSE, the EU Kids Online project across Europe, UNICEF's Office of Research in Achenti, and global partners, which includes the UNICEF country offices around the world, and then researchers and policymakers around the world working in many different countries, some of whom are on this in this meeting today. So it is a dispersed, global and comparative effort at bringing evidence, rigorous, independent evidence into the debate so that we can make those decisions and advise the policymakers in terms of internet governance and related challenges. So at the heart of the Global Kids Online project is a toolkit which allows, as it were, anyone to gather good quality evidence, and a set of research results, as you can see, in which we try to make that evidence available as straightforwardly and as transparently and openly as possible. So if I just so our latest report, I just want to give you a few kind of facts and figures from our latest report, which is a comparison of the findings in 11 countries from different parts of the world. But before I do that, I just wanted to give it a bit of a framing in terms of the evidence relation to policy by pointing out actually the way in which the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which as it were, is the organization behind the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in the way in which they are trying to now think about the implementation of children's rights in relation to the digital environment. And this is through the production of a general comment, a kind of short authoritative text that tries to set out how a convention written, in fact, before the internet was kind of properly embedded in all of our lives, how the convention really relates to the digital. And again, a number of us on this in this discussion today are advising on the drafting of that document, and I hope that many have contributed, because it is in a way, it's very simple to say children's rights apply in the digital environment, offline and online in the same way, and many have said this. But in practice, how this really can be done and how this can be made manifest in the digital world is fantastically challenging. And there's certainly at least one body of opinion that doubts it can be done at all, but we must find a way. Children's rights do apply online as offline, even though what we see is that the digital environment is kind of profoundly reconfiguring the realization of rights, the expression of rights, the array of rights and rights infringements which children are experiencing globally. So the kind of interlink, the way in which the digital is now becoming the infrastructure for children's lives, for all our lives, means that there are not only links between the rights, but those links are now digitally mediated in ways that are complex. So the question that Fabio Senna asks us in guiding this conversation, how do we balance the risks and the opportunities? How do we balance the protection and the participation of children in a digital world? All of these questions of balance and integration are made much more complex, precisely because the digital connects and disconnects in ways that are new and changing very rapidly. So the evidence I want to kind of focus on, and I'm just going to show you two slides with a kind of snapshot of findings from what is a very kind of detailed report to illustrate what I see as some of the key opportunities and what I see as some of the key risks. We've made the slides pretty and communicative to tell a story fast, but I do want to emphasize that gathering evidence on children's experiences in relation to the digital environment in different countries of the world is a very complex and qualified kind of enterprise. We have to try to take account of different languages, of different life circumstances, of different meanings that and ways in which the internet is being kind of appropriated and engaged with around the world. And none of these things are easy to measure, and they're especially not easy to measure when working with children, because there are many ethical and linguistic issues. So I don't present these to do anything simplistic, but just to give you a sense of how it is that one might get evidence on online opportunities. So here are the online opportunities reported by children who use the internet in the countries named. And the opportunities we've listed, as you can see on the left, the countries are along the bottom. The children are internet users aged between 9 and 17. And there are many things one might say from the findings, and I've got 2 minutes left, so I won't say the many things, except to say we see here a kind of ladder of opportunities where the different opportunities build one on the other. And some of the things that children do a lot, like watching video clips or visiting social networking sites, might be the kind of first steps on a ladder that could lead to more children doing some of the rarer things like looking for news or creating their own content or engaging in civic participation. And those are some of the things I think that many would want to encourage more of, but as you can see, are rather rare. So a parallel diagram shows you online risks. Again, we've asked about a number of risks. We tend to ask children about risks to the person. Less so, we need to start asking more about data and commercial forms of exploitation. The countries now are across the top, and you can get a sense of the variation across countries in which risks are more reported and perhaps more common, and the complexity of mapping the opportunities and the risks by context for different children around the world. There's no simple picture, but clearly there is a case to answer. Clearly there are risks which are experienced at high rates. Some of these are very severe risks. And we do make a point of distinguishing risk from harm in framing risk as the probability of harm, just like opportunity is the probability of benefit. And research has yet, I think, to be as robust and comprehensive as we would like in really showing how the risks do translate into harm for some children, perhaps more vulnerable, less resilient, and understanding the long-term consequences is key. So just to kind of conclude, as my time is up, I've skimmed over a number of the challenges that I think the research community faces in translating findings to policy, and I hope colleagues will address that, because from the policymakers' point of view, and actually from the industry's point of view, the digital providers' point of view, there are some real puzzles about identifying children online, recognizing their age and the vulnerability or resilience of their circumstances, because that isn't always apparent from the kind of policy and practice point of view. And as Fabio said right at the start, there are some real challenges in grasping the interconnectedness, because as we see, children who gain more access, gain more skills, they gain more opportunities, they also experience more risks. And what the kind of the magic that we're trying to look for is the way to provide access and skills to bring children opportunities to exercise their rights online while protecting them from their risks, from the risk of harm. I'm going to pass that challenge on to whoever is speaking next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sania, for these very inspiring initial words. I think now I would like to ask Guilherme Canella to join us in this conversation. In given the UNESCO mandate regarding freedom of expression and access to information, I think how policies and regulations can protect children's rights and avoid undesirable threats to civil rights. I think, as Sonia mentioned, through the evidence we have already collected, at the same time, we have several opportunities coming, such as children participating online, producing content, and the freedom of expression in an unprecedented way, but also hate speech and other problems dealing with that. How can really regulation and policies move ahead? And I know you are very critical of having a very specific policies in not having the scale sufficient to really guarantee those rights. So, Guilherme, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Really nice to be with you again, although virtually. This is a very interesting, it was a very expected time of the year for me to be in the IGF and the possibility of meeting all of you in our sessions, but also in the corridors. Unfortunately, this year was not possible, but I'm glad we were able to do that online. So to reply your question, I will divide my 10 minutes in 8 points that I think could help us to understand the challenges for policies. And obviously, if we were having this conversation when we first set up this workshop, the COVID was not that intense. It would be, I think, a completely different discussion. But after COVID, billions of children were prevented to go to school, so they were sent either to an online environment in their homes, or to the huge inequalities that we have regarding the same possibilities of interacting online in different levels of quality, bandwidth, etc., etc. So it's a different perspective. And the point number one with this is related to the rights perspective. All those emergency laws that were established to allegedly deal with the COVID situation attacked directly, not necessarily in line with international human rights standards, some of those rights that we are discussing here today, not only for the children's population, but also to the adult population: freedom of expression, access to information, privacy, participation. All those different rights were affected, as I said, not necessarily in line with international standards of freedom of expression and access to information. And this helped us in this global laboratory experiment that we faced to understand some of those specific challenges and also to raise new questions. So the first important point I want to make is this, that we saw the importance during these last 10 months of those rights of freedom of expression, access to information, to counter some of the problems we are discussing here today, even for children, but also for the adult population. And how the inequalities, the idea of leaving no one behind, can seriously affect the challenges, the opportunities, etc., that were put on the table for the technologies. No? So this is point number one. Point number two is that the policies, either if they are policies issued by governments or by private sector, by NGOs, etc., they will need to really go deeper in discussing the concept. We as UNESCO have been looking with huge concern the mix of concepts like hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories in the same bag. And from a specific standpoint of international legislation, those concepts are treated in a very different way. For instance, while hate speech that leads to violence can be in speech not authorized by the international legislation, disinformation is treated in a different way. So when governments are mixing that in the same package of so-called fake news laws, etc., the dangers for the overall rights, including children's rights, is enormous, and the inefficacy or the lack of efficiency in treating those same problems are also huge. So second point, we need really to develop those concepts better and avoid treating different stories in the same basket, although they have obviously points of contact, like the issue of disinformation. Sometimes hate speech is associated with disinformation, etc. Third point, we need to empower the relevant gatekeepers here. So some of them for the children are the media themselves, journalists, etc., but also the teachers, educators. But nowadays, different gatekeepers have come up, like the social media influencers that are very relevant for children. So how these people are playing the role of helping children to navigate to this very complex environment is particularly relevant, and it was shown very relevant during these last 10 months. Fourth point is the role of the industry, the internet platforms. Obviously here is huge, but I will just mention two things. One is their role in terms of transparency and accountability. I mean, we really don't know what's going on inside the platforms. And this impacts severely your question of evidence-based policy, because we are building things here, obviously, as Sonia has shown, with research being built with the children, listening to them, etc. But this is a tiny little fraction compared with the amount of data that the platforms have about those phenomena, and they don't share with us. They don't share with the researchers, they don't share with the policymakers, etc. And this is a huge problem, because what exactly is the size of the phenomenon of hate speech or disinformation, and how these things reach children? If the platforms, they don't open this, it will be very difficult to develop evidence-based policy related to those issues. And obviously, and the second point I would like to make regarding the platforms is that obviously there are different, the different social media and social messaging, etc., should also be treated by their specific characteristics. So, for instance, the cryptographic systems like WhatsApp or Signal or etc., they offer different challenges in terms of the way children and also adults interact, where compared to the open ones like Facebook or YouTube or etc. Fifth element is the gaming industry. This also had increased enormously during the pandemic. Children has been playing more online, and some of those challenges, advertisement with disinformation, also hate speech, etc., and children interacting via the chat that it's embedded in the game, different online gamings, is another huge story that we need to research more and better to understand the impacts, positively or negative, to children. 6 points is content production. I mean, I've been talking with ministries of education in different parts of the world, and evidently they noticed that they didn't have enough content to share with children during this immediate necessity to send all those children home to interact with homeschooling, etc. Again, reinforcing inequalities, but also reinforcing the challenges of offering an education that could keep children connected with this new way of doing things. No. Seventh point, since the concept of children under the convention is until 18 years old, we have specific challenges that are related to teenagers and older children, but I will focus only one: elections. For instance, in countries like Brazil, children from 16 years old can start voting. And then the impacts of these challenges, disinformation, etc., for elections, and particularly for those children from 16 years old that are able to vote, is enormous. So we need to discuss that better, how children is impacted by disinformation in several areas. Elections is one of them. Discussions of science and climate change is another, and etc., etc. And health issues is very important. And I think this was not very well tackled before the pandemic, and now we open all this huge problem with the disinformation wave, and we will need to go deeper on that. And finally, the eighth point that I think it was also underlined very much during the pandemic, although none of those issues are new, is the impacts on children's mental health or all of those phenomena. And I think still we need more and more research to understand that better, and the policies should be better connected. Mental health in general is a very difficult topic. It's very badly treated by policies across the border, and during the pandemic, it shows that we need to go deeper in this discussion. To wrap up, in terms of policies, we need to balance the things that we are demanding from families and children, and we need to be very careful to not put an overweight on their shoulders, demanding too much as if they were the ones that needed to solve this through obviously things that are important, like media and information literacy strategies, etc. But these children and these families, they are facing a huge phenomena with gigantic structural problems, such as the problems of the platforms or the problems of regulations issued by the governments. So we need to be very careful in saying that the problems that need to be solved here are structural ones when compared to the weight we are putting on the shoulders of the families and the children. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. I think for the whole picture you showed to us. And I would like to invite Amanda Third from the Western Sydney University in Australia. And Amanda, I would like for you to also bring some comments on the work you did on children's consultation. So not just having children as a matter of research, but also as having their voices included in the debate. So as we are how did the evidence available on children's practices online support decision makers implementing policies that can really balance risks and opportunities? So Amanda, you have the floor.
Thanks, Fabio, and thank you for organising this panel. It's a great honour to be here with my esteemed colleagues. Great to see some familiar faces. Yes, Fabio. So yes, I guess I come from the perspective of trying to develop ways to consult with children that really create space for them to explore their experiences in deep kinds of ways, and to channel that qualitative evidence into policy and practice. And so to go to Sonia's question around policy and practice, I think a very important thing that we need to do when we're thinking about effective governance processes is actually to design processes for conducting consultation work that pull in not just children, who are obviously key on our agenda, but also the organisations that support them to do that work with children. And so part of the process that we've developed is called a distributed data gathering process, and it involves us developing a very detailed training manual for facilitators in country, and then those workshops are delivered by personnel, mainly personnel working in child-facing organisations around the world. So the idea is that we build capacity in those organisations to generate evidence with children, but we also, in doing so, give those organisations a close chance to kind of work with children, hear their views, and then that has flow-on effects for policy and practice. So I think we need to think quite cleverly about the ways that we engage children in these conversations, but not just children, also the networks of support and guidance that sit around them. I think clearly the pandemic has really highlighted the need for good governance. And I think the speed at which we've needed to respond has really shown us that quick decisions have been necessary. And I guess one of the great casualties of the pandemic has been, in fact, our capacity to consult with children. It's been severely compromised, not least because we find it difficult to convene with children face to face, which is, a really wonderful way of hearing about their experiences and feeding that into policy and practice. And so I think what we really need to do is to stop and pause and think, how do we do this meaningfully under the new conditions? How do we engage with children in ways that make sense for these particular times? But I've also begun to wonder, and this is really as a consequence of the pandemic, about whether we were asking the right question about governance. We talk, and I'm the first person to be a culprit of this, we talk about needing to balance participation and protection. But in fact, I've begun to wonder, we know that actually if you can secure children's participation, that supports their protection, and vice versa, if you secure their protection, that supports their participation. And so we might actually think of these as mutually constitutive categories, whereas when we talk about balancing them, we sort of tend to think of them as somehow opposing forces. So I think we need to really begin to ask ourselves how we leverage participation and protection together, because together they are more than the sum of their parts, if that makes sense. So I think I guess when I was thinking about what to talk about this evening, I do want to talk about the consultation that we've just done in partnership with 28 organisations around the world, some of whom are on this call, and we've spoken with 700 children in 28 countries in order to inform the drafting of the General Comment on Children's Rights in the Digital Environment. And it's very clear that, children are saying very, very strongly that they want to be part of governance structures, that they really want to be contributing to the decision-making that impacts their lives. And they're calling on states to make room for them to participate. And I think it's vital that we take this very, very seriously. In terms of the issues that they are talking about, still the number one issue for children around the world is the issue of access. And there's clearly a role for strong governance to try to resolve the access challenges. Children are unable to go online when they want to. They're often using second-hand or old devices with short battery life. And, you know, I think we've seen with the pandemic the enormous gap that causes and the great potential to exacerbate existing inequities. But beyond access, children have also said to us very clearly in this latest consultation that they simply don't have enough access to content in a language that they speak. Their language rights are really, really critical here. And again, I think we've seen that in the pandemic, and indeed Guillermo was referencing that earlier. And so there's a real need for governance to create the conditions in which more language content in the languages that children speak can be generated. Children are also crying out for better access to quality information, and in particular, the adolescents we spoke with highlighted the need for quality information, evidence-based information about sexual and reproductive health, sexuality, and indeed about mental health. So sensitive issues that are often taboo in cultures and not easy for children to talk about. They're really calling out for that information to be made available online. And I think, you know, the pandemic's sort of shown us some really interesting effects here. Indeed, I think we can point to some fairly good quality information about the health effects of the pandemic that has been targeted to children. And I applauded Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister's efforts to deliver a press conference for children in which she engaged an epidemiologist and a young science communicator to answer children's questions. I think the thing that we've failed to do, though, is to provide children really with the information they need to navigate the very social disruption to their everyday lives, the impacts of violence in their families, the loss of income, you know, the very real mental health effects that that Guillermo was talking about. So I think there's you know, we need to think information more holistically than we conventionally do, and again, there's a role for governance there. Children in this consultation were very strident in their views on privacy. They are calling out for privacy to be addressed. Previously, when we've spoken to them, they speak most readily about interpersonal privacy. This time around, they still talked about interpersonal privacy, but they were much more attuned to, you know, the issues of data collection, data storage, data use, and the possibilities of economic exploitation. They're calling out for more information, and they're also calling out for governments to regulate those practices much more tightly. And indeed, they say quite willingly that they trust governments a lot more than they trust private enterprise, which you perhaps could say is a healthy attitude to be breeding in our children. Look, there's a lot more to say on those things, but I need to wrap up. So I think you know, in terms of good ways to engage children in governance, I think the consultation we've just run, the international collaboration that made that possible, really speaks to the strength of our capabilities when we come together as international communities. And I think, you know, there's a lot possible if we decide that we're going to enable children to participate in decision-making processes. We can certainly make it happen. But I do think that if there's one thing I could wave a magic wand about this current consultation for the general comment, it would be that I'd like these consultations not to continue to be one-off consultations. I'd love us to see, I'd love us to make spaces inside our governance processes to engage children meaningfully in an ongoing way. And that whether that means that we run parallel processes, whether it may that then come together at certain points, or whether, you know, it's some other configuration. I do think that it's time for us to take that question of children's participation a question that is fundamental to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but which is notoriously difficult to deliver on. It's time for us to take that very seriously, and that would be my big wish.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for your insightful participation. Now, I would like to ask Professor Patricio Cabello from the University of Chile to join us in this conversation. Patricio is a very close partner in Latin America in integrating the Latin American Kids Online network and to promoting research in this field in the region. I would like to ask you if you could comment on the Latin American online surveys, your main findings, and how they can really frame the future of the policy debates, taking the perspective of our region. So, Patricio, you have the floor.
Thank you. Should I show my presentation or not?
You can do it if you want to.
No,
you can share.
I had this presentation, but I will share only a part of it because you have already said some of the things that I was planning to say. But I want to stress just one thing that it has been said before here about the digital divides that are almost like a classic about this subject. And but I want to stress the importance of this remaining material divide, which is showing now the inequalities in this pandemic period that are happening in children's lives, especially in I would say in two different fields. One of them, which is one of my main concerns in the last years, is education, and the second one could be health, maybe. Not only talking about the prevention in the pandemic, but also mental health and well-being. I will refer to just a little bit about I'm sorry, this is in Spanish, this one. But what we are trying to say here, and this is part of what we have done with the Latin American network, is that we have between 50 and 63% of children that are going online from 9 to 17, children and adolescents, from their homes and through a cell phone. So this is what we are calling now this underclass, these underconnected students or underconnected children, which are also in these pandemic times working with underconnected teachers also. And this is meaning like a second-class digital experience for them, which is going to have a huge impact, and we don't know yet even how this is going to impact in the future of their education. Some children, for example, are in the first 2 years of school, and some of them are going through these 2 years without learning to read, and this is going to be very, very hard for us here in Latin America, what we're going to do with these children in the next few years. And in my opinion, there is not yet a well structured initiative from the public policy makers to think or to discuss about this. And in the other side, which is also as important as the underconnected, is that we have this kind of the connected elite, this connected elite that is of connected teachers and connected students that are using multiple devices from multiple locations, and they have absolutely bridged the first digital divide. They are living in the digital world with no problems. So this is affecting all the things that we are talking about here, and the deeper inequalities in education in this remote emergency education that we are talking about, which is like this new and very interesting subject, which you can say, you can check on all the research. The research is very scarce until now about what to do with this emergency remote education. in the case of children. And this I'm going just to mention this, the thing is of appropriations and from skills to practices and digital participation in the digital society, that is of course also under the same influence of the same inequalities, lower participation for low socioeconomic status, the age, for example, that is very important. And also how material access is having a huge impact on this, you know? How, for example, these underconnected children that are using only cell phone and connecting from home are having much less opportunities in this digital society. This is about digital skills, for example, that you can have them. The details of this in a report. I will show you the reference at the end of the presentation. But the thing is always that these underconnected children are absolutely like disadvantaged children in this digital society. So what I would say about the outcomes of many different things that we have done, I can comment on something that and a research that I've been working through this time. We're working with children of second grade, which they are like 8 years old, on mathematics through digital environment using digital material. It's like an online series of how to learn some stuff about problem solving. And we're working with teachers that use this material and also receiving what children do with this. And what we are looking at, and what is very important, is that, for example, in the high-risk schools, the most poor schools, for example, in Chile, many of these children are not attending to classes even online, even when they are connected, because many of their parents do not have the digital skills or the time or anything else to help them just to connect or to get the school materials. So many of them live, for example, with their grandmother, which is a very old lady that doesn't have ever touched a computer in her life. So it doesn't mind even if we have this access, that these other divides are showing very deeply, and the role of parents, for example, as mediators, it's showing now, like I think never before. It's been so evident. Schools cannot absorb now, for example, the inequalities of homes, you know, the inequalities of how people of the poorest part of the structure of our societies in Latin America are living through this. So I would say that the future effects would be a very important subject to discuss and for research also. What's going to happen from here to 5 or 10 years with these children, especially those that are not having, for example, preschool education, many of them. Okay, and I think that there's something that I have like two minutes or something like that. I think we will face this new phenomena, or we will face the real phenomena that is happening with the inequalities of digital. But also we're watching how this is going to this is affecting as a deeper change, you know. For example, in the role status of formal education in the digital age, what's the point, for example, to go to school, for example, for some children, or what are they missing, or what we will achieve, for example, with more digital devices and more digital materials to work with children at schools, that we haven't thought about that, at least in Latin America, in a very, very strong sense, I think, yet. The expectations of teachers, for example, I have conducted in the late months, like 10 I would say dozens of interviews with teachers, and they are very frustrated about this, you know. This has been very, very difficult for them, and very, very demanding and stressing, and many of them are using all the time they have in the day just to teach, for example, this grandmother or mother or father, just to connect and to get the access to the material for the children, calling them by phone, etc. So I will say a few things very, very quickly. I think that we should keep thinking about this first digital divide. We have not overcome the first digital divide, even in developing countries like Chile, but there are other countries that is more dramatic and more difficult even, of course. This is what I'm calling lately this spiral of inequalities, with this relation between being outside of this digital world or underconnected in the digital world, and at the same time, this is of course affecting on reproducing these inequalities. I have two ideas, so two main focuses for bridge this digital divides. The first is family, and the second one is school. And I would say the third one is community. That is something that we have neglected a lot, I think. And the outcomes yet to come, we will know in the future. I think we need to assess that, to start assessing what is happening with that in the next few years. And I don't have the answer to this question, because as I said, many are just left behind in this process. You know, I have, for example, interviews with the teachers that said that more than half of their students are not attending at all. They do not appear. They do not use any digital media or anything to get access to school. They are just out of school, and this is very, very dramatic. In Chile, for example, which is the country with less dropout students in the whole region. Now we're facing this is like something that we should have overcome like 20 years ago, and now we are facing that we have lots of children that are not attending to school, and this is very risky. And you know that not attending to school is the one of the most strong predictors of risks for children in any environment. So how policymakers are now facing this situation, or how they should do it, I don't have the answer for these questions, but I think that this is for the discussion. And so thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to meet you here, and I hope this is interesting for you.
Thank you very much, Patricio, for your insightful contribution. Now I'll give the floor finally, but not least, to Amanda Trocero, which is a regional specialist on adolescents for UNICEF in Latin America and the Caribbean Regional Office. And of course, UNICEF is a very important player in this debate. Now I would ask Alejandra if you could also want to provide some useful examples or practical policies that UNICEF deal that connect this whole debate on balancing rights. So how to the 3 Ps, the provision, the protection, and participation, can be really implemented when dealing with this type of policy. So you have the floor, please, for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Fabio. And before I dive into your question, I would like to contextualize a little bit more about what Patricia was saying, because when I was thinking about this session, and thank you for the invitation, I was thinking, well, what is some of the issues that we're facing in Latin America? And obviously the COVID epidemic has impacted our life in a way that we were not expecting ever. And I wanted to draw the attention to the education and the crisis that we are facing that Patricia mentioned. I just wanted to give you some figures. 137 million children are missing out on their education. So 1/3 of all Latin America and the Caribbean countries do not have yet a date for starting a school. So the schools continue to remain closed in most of Latin America. So we're having a huge issue in our region. And children in the region have lost 4 times more schooling than in the rest of the world. So we really are facing here a phenomenal crisis. And I think we shouldn't underestimate what is happening in our region, particularly when, and taking the point of Patricio, in terms of inequalities, because most kids are missing out because there is no structures in place for them to be able to assist digital learning, but also because there is no way that ministers of health or ministers of education, are able to respond to that huge demand. They were completely, entirely unprepared. So, so moving now into your question and taking this educational situation and educational crisis into account, I think one of the issues that we're facing in the Latin America in terms of regulation is, for example, that we don't have safety policies in place in the education system. Very few countries are moving into ensuring, for example, safe words policies, ensuring that there is good procedures in terms of online one-to-one interactions between students and teachers, how we ensure that there is a safe learning environment for children. And I think this is an area that we need to look into more detail on exactly how the regulations that, in the schools are taking place, how we ensure those safety interactions between teachers and students, and that ensure that are safe and in a transparent way and are regulated. We are also facing an issue in terms of the digital divide that Patricia mentioned. The technological companies should work much more with government to help in the regulation, to improve the access to the digital connectivity, whether our devices, internet connections. I think there are a conversation that is happening, and I want to mention that from UNICEF we are making a huge push to increase the to increase access to devices and increase access to internet. We are currently mapping in a number of countries. We are mapping the access to internet in schools. Unfortunately, most of this work is going to be interrupted because we are coming to a second hurricane in the countries where we were doing this mapping, like El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. That are all facing between today and tomorrow a huge hurricane, second one in 2 weeks. So most of this work will be also interrupted. So I think some of the challenges that we have in our region is to move forward and at the same time adjust it to go back because the pandemic has moved us behind, but also in Central America in particular, the current crisis is moving us even much backwards. So this is a concern that we are having. So going back to the companies, I think access to digital devices and internet and ensuring that the online resources are made available for free or for low cost for people who need it the most. And I would say for free in our region. Content, as Guilherme say, is an issue, and we have to ensure that those the companies that are working in our region get committed to make sure that these resources became available for free. And the issue around how we trained providers, whether they're teachers, are health providers, are social workers, how we train them to ensure that they have the skills to support children to navigate safely internet, but also how they work with parents and teachers for that to happen. We do have reporting mechanisms. They are very vague, they are general, they are national level. How we move down some of these reporting mechanisms to local level, how we ensure the kids understand where the mechanisms for reporting online safety issues in a way that is linked to them, meaning they don't need to go to a place that are completely unfamiliar to them, but there is something much more local where they could report. Something that we noticed over the last few months is the importance of the helplines and the hotlines to support children. And we see much more reporting taking place And I do think that we need to look at it, how the reporting mechanisms are happening, are shaped within the digital environment. So because it's happening in online, but how that privacy, data reporting, data privacy is happening, and whether there is good regulations taking place. I have the sense that in our region we have a lot of work to do. At the moment, we are working with governments in terms of ensuring that the headlines and the policies, the mechanisms that are in place for reporting are safe, but also ensuring that there are better referral mechanisms when reporting are taking place. The second area that we are working much more is with the technological companies and making them more aware of the risk, but also working with them in ensuring that in the context of the pandemic, we are, for example, in Colombia, we are modeling a program where we are engaging children to understand and gain the skills to navigate online safely. We're working with teachers and parents to give them the skills for that. We're working is part of a platform of a technological company. So we're working with a company to be more aware of the implications of some of their policies and working through them with them on that. And at the same time, advocating for the government to change some of the policies and ensuring that there are children dedicated policies in place, and within the telecommunication organism, they have a unit dedicated to children's safety. So this is, in a nutshell, what some of the things that we are doing, but some of the big challenges that we face in the region. And unfortunately, I feel that the challenge is increasing because of the big gaps that exist today, the inequalities that are manifesting right now, and the ongoing crisis that we have in terms of education. The World Bank predicts that this region will lose 1.2 billion as a result of the educational crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. And thank you all for keeping on the time. Now we have 30 minutes for discussion, which is very, very good, because now I have time to interact with other participants. We have some questions here. I would like to start by maybe clustering the two first questions there are dealing with the governance issues, which are the third question that we raised in the seminar. So Carlos Afonso asks, what mechanism do you suggest for children to participate in governance? In a sense that we can move the situation. And another question, recovering the last IGF in Berlin, where young people strongly demanded to be engaged in internet governance with the call "Nothing About Us Without Us." So how you can really engage. But I would like to ask Sonia to start with that, pushing not just to, of course, to include children in the debates in IGF, but also how can you really push the participation, including on the platforms and government. So there's a difficult situation where we need to implement actual mechanism that works and that the children have their voices heard. So what are your opinion on this, Sonia, please?
So that's a huge question, Fabio, and there are many ways of answering it, because there are many things to be done. I mean, in essence, now that the digital world is so important to everything, as people on this discussion have very eloquently said, involving children in questions that are happening in the digital world is involving them in the world. We have, just as we are trying to involve children, or we should be involving children in participation in any area and with any organization that has power, that makes a difference to their lives. But I think questions around technology, and someone has a question about the speed, the pace of change, the complexity of change, and the kind of the global nature of internet governance, those things make it particularly difficult. We have to applaud the efforts of the IGF to include a youth IGF to try to make these very meetings open to often or sometimes for children and young people to join in. But this is a pretty kind of alienating experience for many. So we need multiple mechanisms at multiple levels. But I do particularly, Amanda will speak for herself in a minute, but I do think the model of working out how questions can be addressed in local organizations, in the places where children are, that they can be asked by the people who already are around children and young people and work with them. That has to be powerful. And then the question is getting their voices listened to. And I think often the problem is not so much have the children got things to say, because they have, but can we get people with the power in internet governance to really take note? And that's a challenge that, the IGF just has to take up much more forcibly, as do governments around the world. When they make their decisions about internet governance, they forget that children are 1 in 3 of the world's internet users. And the very purpose of figuring out they are 1 in 3 is to say they are, they are incredibly important. They are part of the world. Surveys of people does not mean surveys of adults. It's got to include everybody. So, many things need to be done. I would just say, as my last point, perhaps, in some ways, the digital world should be the easiest world, because children and young people are ready to speak about this. They have so much to say. They believe it's their domain, and they are ready to use the digital tools to communicate with them. Sometimes that results in rather kind of superficial polls, in rather kind of scattershot or, not very representative ways of collecting little snippets of what children have to say, which is not fair to them and which doesn't get their voices really amplified. So, it has to be taken as a serious undertaking. We can't carry on talking without, 1 in 3 of the population included.
Thank you, Sonia. I really would like to hear Amanda about this. Amanda, can you also comment on that?
Yes, Fabio. Look, I think Sonia's said pretty much everything there. I think the only other thing that we could do, perhaps to leverage the digital in support of children's participation, is actually to extend access to all children everywhere. As my colleagues have been highlighting, this is a really key challenge, and it's one that children consistently raise, and it's just not receiving enough attention. I think in terms of the mechanisms for children's participation in governance, I think it very much depends on what we mean by governance, right? In a kind of very, let's say, constrained definition of governance, where we're talking about legislation and regulation, the actions of governments. But of course, governance is a much broader undertaking, a much more significant project than that. Indeed, governance is about the sort of interdependence and ongoing interaction between government and non-government actors, whereby, we negotiate structures and processes and relations of decision-making and accountability. And so from that perspective, I think we need to really begin to think governance as a kind of cultural project, right? We need to nurture cultures of governance which are inclusive of children, and that means that we have to sort of step back. We have to scrutinize our processes. As Sonia says, many of the decision-making forums that we have in place currently are very alienating for children. There's definitely scope to use the digital to engage children in those decision-making processes. But really, I think as organizations and institutions, we need to really put our own practices under the microscope and throw them up in the air, in a sense, and actually then work with children to design processes that would enable them to feed into decision making. I think it's quite likely that the right processes will look very different from one place to the next. And I think, we need to remember that, and again, this is a point that was implicit in what Sonia was saying, if not explicit, is that, when we're talking about governance for the digital world, we are actually talking about children's right to participate in the world per se. And I think this is really, it's not that radical, but we've got to put our mind to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. No, you have a very good point. And now I would like to give the floor to Guilherme, maybe to comment on another question we have. And I think it's also a question connected with the governance issues, is that how to enforce something like to avoid disinformation or misinformation given that the concept is not clear and is misused, as you said, in a mix of conceptual interest. So I think this is an issue of not just who should deal with the governance process, but also how to enforce issues that are not well defined and conceptualized. So can you talk about this specific question?
Sure. Just one quick add to the previous discussion about involving children. I think we had this bad practice in the past for several reasons, that when we have children's issues, it was dealt by the Ministry of Children in a particular government, or the Secretary of Children. And it was very similar to the internet. The internet area of the government was a very specific area. And we need to acknowledge now that those issues should have been treated from the beginning across the border. And then we will need to discuss the governance issues on very specific, with the specificities of each area. So for instance, we need to discuss with the data protection or privacy regulator how to include the children's issues in their mandate. We need to discuss with the access to information regulator, the informational commissioners, how children should be heard through access to information practices and consultations. We need to discuss with the e-government part of the governments how, when they are designing e-government policies, the children are being considered. We need to discuss with the judiciary when children need to be heard in their cases involving them, and they are using more and more digital procedures, how children is going to be taken into consideration. This is the real governance story, instead of putting a children's whatever in an internet governance specific area of the government, because then we will continue making the same mistakes that we did in the past to make these niches areas that does not take care of does not accommodate the reality anymore, that all of those issues are now across the border, and maybe they were from the beginning. Regarding the specific question of misinformation and disinformation, we need to acknowledge that this is a very complex phenomenon, that it's not going to be tackled by any specific only answer. It's not only regulation, it's not only self-regulation, it's not only a fact-checking, it's not only media and information literacy, it's all of those things. And because it is a gigantic phenomenon with different sorts of causes and symptoms, etc. But we need to acknowledge the structural elements of this phenomena. We know a lot, although we don't know everything about it. And what we already know shows that it's a combination of different areas. One of them is fact-checking, another is media and information literacy. But perhaps the bottom line here is that this kind of phenomena, disinformation and misinformation on one side, or hate speech in another, very often the best way of dealing with that is with more freedom of expression and not with less, is to counter those speech problems with more speech. So when governments are trying to do legislations to tackle disinformation, to take down fake news, the so-called fake news or hate speech, very often they are affecting the same groups that allegedly they were trying to protect: children, women, minorities, etc. because they are using these as Trojan horses to stop political debate, to stop political speech, to stop the discussions about those issues that we want to tackle. So we need to be very careful in dealing with this, because the architecture of the internet is like castles of cards. If you take one card of the castle, the entire architecture can disrupt. So the basics recommendation from UNESCO, let's look that very carefully. Let's combine different solutions, and particularly let's ask for more transparency in dealing with those issues, so that we can take better and informed decisions when we are discussing this.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. Now I would like to give the floor to both Patricio and Alejandra, which both mentioned teachers and training teachers and all the discussion on education. And we have a question on the limits of remote education, especially during the COVID outbreak. So could you briefly comment on this area of your research with teachers and how to implement policies regarding this issue?
There are many different situations and data about this. I'm very biased by what is happening here in Chile, because almost all my research is here. So I don't know if I can talk about Latin America, but at the same time, what has happened here in Chile is always like an example for many other policies in the region. So I have one data of one of recent research, very interesting and very simple. It was very simple about training pre-service teachers, and we found out that analyzing the structure of their studies plans, which here in Chile are very structured. And we find that 35% of them didn't have any ICT course, not even Excel or not even PowerPoint, how to use a Word or something like that. Not even that. 35% didn't have that, and also they don't have anything that it's for in the what they say that they should learn at the end of this project, which is not even a module that it's through all the plan. So what we have is teachers that do not have that are not having the tools that they need for this, and this is going to be, if you check this, is worse if you do a long-term research to the past 10 years. So what we are doing now is trying to understand what is happening with these teachers, and of course we are showing also the big and terrible inequalities even in learning for teachers, because the top-ranked universities are teaching this for pre-service teachers like 10 years ago. They start to do this, and the low-quality universities here are teaching nothing about this. So it's very difficult then to work with teachers on training on how to use digital tools for classes. So we have very strong inequalities in our educational system from the beginning, from what teachers are learning before they start. So that's one problem. I would say that another problem, which is not usually addressed, at least here, is how teachers should work with families in an alliance for this, how to teach parents to teach children in these environments. So this is going to be a huge, I would say this is going to be a huge something that we should overcome in the next years to understand that how it's going to be included family is not only about how family have to give orientation about values about children. That's of course that's important, but also that parents as an active agent in teaching in learning. And that's something that this is showing very, very important. We're looking and how are many children also from high SES, for example, for high socioeconomic status, that are absolutely abandoned in their houses to just for learn what, I don't know, and parents that believe strongly about this thing about the digital natives, because it's like the new religion for access, and from their point of view, it's very difficult to work with that, because they believe that they know how to use this, so they will catch up with school and so on. And this is showing the inner inequalities of also these classes, where do you have this idea of the advantaged children, which is supposed to be a genius, so he can manage everything by alone, and we have nothing to do with that. So it's I think we have to rethink what we are thinking about our educational system. I think that's something that's very important for us, and I think it has a huge impact on participation also in many other ways, because the first place for participation for children, the first institution that they have to be participating are the schools. So now they are not only outside of learning environments, but they are also outside of the most primary and most stronger, the stronger institution for participation for children. So I think we will be discussing this for years to come, I think, and we have to start working now. I think one thing is pre-service training for teachers, which is absolutely, for us, that's absolutely urgent, to change that way of thinking.
Thank you, Patricio. Now, Alejandra, do you have some comments on that?
Just quickly to say that something that has happened that is very positive in Latin America is the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education had come together to share curriculums, to share strategies for creating, for basically decreasing the digital divide, for getting teachers much more up to speed to use the digital means. But those, I think, as Patricia was saying, we have a long way to go still. But there are very positive experiences coming up in terms of South-to-South collaboration, of governments working together to try to solve some of these challenges. Yeah, and I just wanted to say, in terms of participation and engaging young people and adolescents in particular, I think what we are seeing in this region is that because of the familiarity with online, we see much more conversations taking place and participation happening in a much more spontaneous way. And the climate change movement is a good way to see how children and mostly adolescents are coming together to put pressure in the governments. So we see a new generation as well of children expressing their voices in ways that they are setting up the ways in which they wanted to engage. And there is no mediated by adults right now. So I think there are certain experiences as well that we need to look in more detail to learn from them, to influence decisions in terms of bigger governments in a way. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Thanks very much. I think you have time for a final round of comments, very brief and final comments. And I would go we have two questions on the future, on how this very fast changing environment can be regulated. So the difficulties of regulating this very fast changing event, and everybody mentioned COVID crisis and how this is a breaking point for us. So I would go in 1 minute, if you could please bring us what should the researchers and the policy agenda look to look for in this moment we are now. So maybe doing the opposite order. I'll start by Alejandra. Alejandra, if you can bring us some in 1 minute, what do you think is the agenda should look for? Not just the research agenda, but also the policy agenda.
I would say in terms of policy agenda, we do need to look into safe work mechanisms at the different levels. And I'm talking about, in terms of education, which is something I'm concerned about, but in terms of participation, in terms of the regulations that take place with the private sector, how we engage the private sector much more, how we, particularly from UNICEF, how we, and it's something that we are trying to do, is to bring that conversation between private sector and government. So bringing that conversation much more closer. So from my perspective, and in terms of some of our priorities in the region, I would say issues around reducing barriers, basically, and connecting the dots, connecting the private sector with government, with education system, and trying to have that conversation with and promoting participation, of course, because is a core part of all the work that we are doing.
Thank you, Alejandra. Patricio, what's your final?
I would say something that, because we're talking about policy making and what can we say? I would say something that is something that maybe it's too general, but I would say that in the case, for example, of our countries in Latin America, we need a stronger presence of the state, a stronger presence of the institutions. And education, for example, and digital access, for example, it's a field where private sector have done very good things, but for this is absolutely not enough. It's not going to be self-regulated, or it's not. I think we need strong institutions and a strong presence of the state of the states also, as Alejandra said, to work on this matter, because it's not something that is going to end next year when we have a vaccine. It's something that is going to last for decades, maybe. I think that's it.
Thank you, Patricio. Amanda, what's your late night comment?
I have to say, Fabio, I am scraping the bottom of the barrel, as they say. But actually, I want to sort of pick up where Patricio just left off. I think it's clear that we're going to live with some significant challenges for an extended period of time, and that means several things. It means, in terms of the ways we orient to the future, it means that we need better processes for hearing one another. I mean, we've returned to this question of children's participation a lot, and I think the thing that I haven't said that perhaps I really want to say about that is that children have plenty to say. They speak all the time. Actually, it's adults that don't have the capacity to listen. Our institutions need to grow larger ears, right? So I think that's really important. But I think in terms of the ways that we orient ourselves to the future, we need to kind of really we really need to start listening a lot more, and we need to have the long-term game in mind. I think all of us in the aftermath of the pandemic have sought the quick fix, the kind of the set of, the checklist of things that we can all do to kind of make children safe and enhance their participation. But actually, no, it doesn't work like that. It's a long road ahead, and the most urgent thing that we can do is start thinking about the long term and acting on the long term now.
Thanks, Amanda. Guilherme, what's your final words?
One of the things that was questioned a lot in the chat is about, as Sonia mentioned, the pace of technology. And I think one of our mistakes related to this is precisely to focus too much in the specific technology, in the specific app, in the specific platform, while the principles are the same. So in terms of policy, I think that we have still a long road to walk, for instance, regarding protecting specific rights of the children that are important for these discussions, such as freedom of expression and privacy. I guess the next 20 years will be a lot of discussion on how we protect more and we enhance children's rights to freedom of expression, to access to information, and to privacy. But I'm not saying anything new. This was already in the Article 19 of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, where the mothers and founders of that declaration didn't mention any specific technology. They said those rights were available by own frontier and by own technology. So they were already a vanguardist in that sense. This is in terms of policy. In terms of research, obviously, it will keep important to discuss risks and harms and opportunities such as hate speech, disinformation, etc. But we will need to have more research on the structural problems, on how the algorithms impact all of this, artificial intelligence, the way the platforms are organized. I think we are just scratching the surface if we keep concentrating all the efforts in situations, in discussions like hate speech, etc. As I said, they are important, but the structural problems should be more investigated. And I think this will be the new frontier in terms of research and how they related to the children's particular challenges.
Thank you, Guilherme. Now, Sonia, you have the floor.
So I have one thought. It's quite a practical thought, because I think what we haven't discussed so far is the fact that in other parts of the Internet Governance Forum, governments and companies are all figuring out how they can get ahead in the most competitive way in order to maximize profit, put bluntly. And I think the vaccine is a really interesting example because we're facing the same race for the successful vaccine all around the world, and some companies are going to make a lot of money. But as a public, we've all learned something very basic, haven't we? We've all learned that whoever thinks they've got a vaccine, before it can get out into the public, it has got to be properly tested by properly independent, authoritative bodies which set standards that are internationally recognized, and nothing is going to reach the public until that process has been checked. And that's what we should be doing with digital technology.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much all for your participation. It's a pleasure to moderate the session. I think we have lots to discuss and to keep researching, acting, and thank you very much. And we are welcome also to share all the strategies we have in those networks and reporting this to IGF. So thank you very much. Be safe wherever you are, and thanks for your participation. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Fabio.
Yeah.
Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you from IGF hosts. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.